Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. It's the spooky season, and that means I'm coming around to my usual let's watch a whole month worth of appropriately thematic movies. And this week I watched The Witch from 2015, or as some people call it, The Vivitch. This was a mistake on the part of the production. If you ask me, typographically, the reason why it looks like that is because they were trying to replicate the way old printing presses would often render a W, which was just two V's, because despite being different letters, it didn't typographically make sense to make a whole new stamp just for that. It was just how letters were rendered differently at the time, and it confused a lot of people. That said, it probably also brought a lot of attention via jokes, so maybe it all comes out in the wash. Anyway, this movie is called The Witch, and it's a movie that I have heard about a bunch and thought about a bunch from time to time, and mostly avoided because, frankly, as I've talked about before, I don't really do super scary films. And I was under the impression that this was kind of in the realm of the things that I tend to try to avoid. That being stuff that is more on the more jump scary, more grotesque sides of horror, which is generally the stuff I try to avoid. I like a good psychological thriller, those sorts of things. You've seen me go through a couple of these now. And I was under the impression this was just not going to be something I really I was going to have a good time with. But it came up in conversation again recently, and I was like, let me at least give it a shot. If I get into it and I'm not having a good time and I want to stop, I'll just stop and I'll be okay with being done with it and that it's not for me. And I'm glad that I gave it a shot, because it's not what it initially seems. That's not to say that there aren't moments of that. There certainly are. But okay, I don't think this is a spoiler to talk about too much. There is basically nothing in the way of jump scares in the entire film. There are scenes of heavy anticipation where it seems like in a cheaper movie they might have done that, but there are no jump scares. Like, any horror that they want to show you is shown in a creeping but direct way that they reveal to you. And this is a note to the musical composition. For better or for worse, the musical compositions do a very good job of building the tension that is already in the scene, but is perhaps, frankly, a little overdone due to the music. That's not to say that the music is bad. It's actually extremely good. Being able to render emotions in you that are only sort of there in the scene already is a huge feat. Whether or not I necessarily agree with them choosing to go that way, especially because of the direct expectation comparisons that you may have if you're more of a horror connoisseur, more of the type that likes those jump scare kinds of things, those sounds of building tension, etc., tend to be released after. And this movie doesn't really do that, so it doesn't really have that same sort of release, or it has releases but in a different way. As far as the super gory, grotesque sort of thing, it's actually pretty sparing. And what is shown is generally shown very indirectly. There's a lot of very careful discretion that's that is used to show things that are, I would say, pretty disturbing, but it's mostly implications. It's mostly indirect. If there are acts of violence or injury or whatever, they're shown in indirect ways. And I think that serves it in multiple ways. One, it leaves to your imagination some of those things to imagine your own version of it. And sometimes the things in your mind, I don't think this will be a surprise to anybody who likes horror. The things in your mind can be far worse than the things as they really are. And that also lets them get away with, from a production side, not having to do certain things on screen, where the implication of something happening is more than enough to tell what they want to tell. And because they do it, they execute it in a very competent way. That all works out to give you enough without them having to actually have done it. Whether it's a technical limitation they might have, or a budgetary limitation, or whatever, that all works in their favor. And yet that's not to say that they don't have like some very good practical effects quite all over this film. In fact, the scenes where it does sort of start to like churn my stomach a little bit, even when things are shown indirectly, there are the implications or the small side things that are shown very directly are very well done. Grotesque and unsettling and all too real looking. And I think that it deserves a lot of credit for that. As a side note, since I haven't talked about this yet, this movie was made for only like $4 million. And it's the directorial and writing debut of this director. I'll put a pin in that and come back to it when I talk about the cast a little bit. I think that overall this tells a very simple story that works a lot on all of its framing devices and its anticipation, and both leaning into and subverting various horror tropes to tell a rather different kind of experience and tell a rather different kind of story. I think it's really, really interesting for a whole bunch of reasons. And I understand why some people think this is such a masterpiece. I don't necessarily, especially on further reflection, I don't necessarily feel that I completely agree, but I understand where some of those thoughts are coming from. So to talk about the plot a little bit first, in a non-spoiler way, the plot is very thin. This movie really works very much on a sense of context and character and expectation. It is a period piece set in the 1600s in the New World. Settlers, Puritans from England who have come over and established some sort of colony of some sort. I don't think it's ever specified where or when exactly they are, but it's shown to be sort of, it's an interesting point that I didn't think about until just now, actually. This could devolve really poorly into a particular kind of narrative, which is the narrative that is often told in a lot of even history books, mostly of an older ilk, that the horrors of living in the New World had to do with like the wilderness and the, big air quotes here, savages, and so on and so forth. They subvert that very, very early in a way that it didn't click just now to me until just now, that they subvert it almost immediately, because in the very first scene, you see native peoples working in tandem with the settlers, the white settlers there, implying that this is not a state of warring or whatever. They immediately subvert any expectations that it could be something that is related to relationships with the natives, which I think is really smart. And I didn't realize it did that until now. Anyway, sidebar over. The setup for the movie is very simple, that this family sets out on their own for reasons I won't get into, to live basically by themselves. A mother, a father, their 4 kids. And this is really the setting for both literally and figuratively everything that is going to be explored in the film. And it's fascinating to reflect upon the film as a whole after seeing it to the end, because at first as I was watching through this, I really thought this was a very heavily metaphorical film. And as we went through, I sort of realized that it isn't. Now, we could get into a whole discussion about the state of horror, the horror genre through various ages, and how the horror genre largely is used in metaphorical and allegorical ways to talk about the fear of living in reality in various ways, and the things that happen inside people's heads and inside people's communities, et cetera, et cetera. And that's still very relevant to this film. But what's actually kind of more interesting to me is how it very directly but subtly, well, it's not even subtle. It very directly explores what it would mean for these people in this time to live through the experiences that they're having with the worldview and understanding of things that they had at the time. This is sort of an interesting topic on its own about the state of using sort of older settings or historical settings for the purposes of horror, because it gives you more flexibility as a writer to write, lack of knowledge or lack of access to resources or those sorts of things in without having to really explain further. It's a very easy, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way either. It's a very easy way to write a more simple narrative that you can explain less directly. But rather than this being a narrative about either a heavy-handed metaphor about the horrors of living in the wilderness or something like that, or about any sort of real big air quotes supernatural effects and those sorts of things, it turns away from a lot of the typical horror things to instead sort of directly discuss the emotional aspects of what living in that time would be. And I think that's what's most interesting about this. I know I've sort of gone in a circle already about this, but I'm trying to say a lot without saying a lot, because I think this is worth watching. This is, more than almost any other horror film I've seen, very much a character study, character drama. It is about the individuals and their relationships to each other and their relationship to the world that they live in, and both their historical relationships and the ongoing evolution of those relationships. So this is all couched to some extent. I'd be very curious for somebody who's watching this outside of the United States and outside of having had an education that included an education of the Puritans and their landing in what would be America, because it lends itself to a certain understanding of who those people were and what they knew and what they had access to. This is very directly, all sorts of aspects of this movie are very directly attached to them being Puritans and them having this attachment to their faith and their raw clinging to their faith as a way to explain everything and validate everything. and yet at the same time, all of the foibles in doing so, and how they lie to each other and they lie to themselves, or they genuinely believe things that are simply not true, or this, that, and the other thing, and how that affects their relationships with each other and their relationship with the world. That rather than even with the context that they have, very often, rather than making rational decisions, this is really a story about a family falling apart because nobody can communicate honestly. It's a weird thing to think about, because everything about the movie doesn't say that it is that. But you take a step back from the story, and that's exactly what it is. Like, everything else is set dressing. It's excellent set dressing. It's really, really well fleshed out set dressing, to the point that you don't notice this is like a family falling apart story. But that's what this is. It's about a literally and figuratively isolated group of people who are isolated from their world, isolated they've isolated themselves to their singular location, to their singular home, their singular family. They are away from the rest of the colony. They are away from their original home, being in Europe. They are away from everything they know and understand. And the only thing they have is the things that they can control directly, and the only people they know are each other, right? And so that all leads to this sense of it's already a tense situation, even if it were a situation that was working well. But when things start to go awry, the familial tensions of these beliefs and the way they interact with their beliefs and the lies that they tell each other and all of this, that's what leads back into the main sort of semi-supernatural story that is present in the sort of core narrative. The things that you see on screen are talking about these supernatural events that are happening or seem to be happening, and what that means to the characters, or how they react to those things. And rather than trying to understand or even ignoring their understanding of what's happening and choosing to try and make rational decisions, it only causes them to devolve further into their coping mechanisms, their behaviors, and their abuses of each other. Because at its core, this story is deeply about control and fear, and how a community, no matter how small, even if it's down to an individual family, will under stress eat itself alive, eat itself from the inside. How nothing can be more destructive to a group than itself, because nobody knows that group closer than itself, right? And I don't want to talk too much about individual plot beats or events that happen, but that's what leads to this more overarching narrative following our primary character, I would say, Thomason, who is really the receiver. She's the main character, but she's also the receiver of basically everybody's mistreatment. And this is not done in some, it's not done in some tropified way. This isn't, the poor abused kid or whatever. This is how this family dynamic has worked out. Because she's the eldest, because she's female, and because of the relationship that she has with her various family members, she's sort of given all of the responsibility and none of the respect. She's constantly to be blamed for whatever. And because of everybody else's personal struggles, they end up foisting those things back onto her. Meanwhile, she's not asking for anything extraordinary, short of just sort of being treated as an equal among, even not even an equal. She's sort of wants to be treated with the barest amount of humanity within the context of her time and place, even. And that's what sort of gets to the one sort of main metaphor that runs through, which is about how all of these things that I've previously talked about are about her trying to gain some modicum of control or freedom in a world that at every turn from every side wants to keep her from having any control, where even in her efforts to tell truth and to be good, everything she does is interpreted by others as being an act of evil or whatever you want to say about it. And so little of the movie is about the supernatural things that are happening, that they can basically be ignored. They are there as primarily, as I said before, like very good set dressing, as well as just these sort of catalysts for other things to happen within the family. And strictly speaking, you could go through this movie and either literally cut out of the film or just in your head say these things didn't actually happen to every supernatural event. And there is either a totally normal in-world explanation about it, or it just doesn't matter and it could just be completely imagined. And because of the emotional states of all these characters and their paranoia and anger and whatever else, all these feelings around each other, they can just imagine these things, and it doesn't matter whether they're real or not, because that's the dynamic. That belief and fear have so removed this family from their ability to think and behave rationally, or even, in really any way at all. That it I don't know. Like I'm just sort of rambling about it at this point because it's such a fascinating construction of a film. That said, like, I don't think I think everything about the structure is so impressive. Whereas even though everything about this is more than the sum of its parts, but that's not to say that the parts themselves are individually lacking in any way either. I think if you try to separate those things, they do start to be a little like, oh, you could have done this better and that better. This aspect of the production could have been fleshed out more. This story could have had a more cohesive narrative. But even that, like, gets to a certain deliberateness, I think. It's up for interpretation. Authorial intent is hard to interpret. But I think it's somewhat intentional, the chaos of the film. Some of those things that I might look at from a very critical eye as shortcomings could easily be intentional, or just, they work out, whether intentional or not, to serve the rest of the tone of the film, the tone of the narrative. So I guess that's like most of my thoughts about the actual watching of the piece of art itself. As far as the production goes, like, especially for $4 million ish, this is very, very impressive. And that's not to say that this isn't like a cheap film to make, I guess I should say. It's hard to use these words properly, but this is a film that doesn't have a lot of technical demands on it. They had to build a few historical looking locations, not very much. The sets are very limited. The scope of the film is very limited. The locations, all of that. A lot of it is shot in basically wilderness. They didn't need very many costumes. They didn't need, a lot of complexity. So that reduces the cost of making something like this very substantially. But with that said, I think everything about the production is done super well. The details in the clothes, in the things that they carry, the tools that they have, all those sorts of things. I don't know. I'm not an expert on it. So some of it may or may not be anachronistic for, like the 1600s. But it all looks really good to me. I say it looks really good. I have my ups and downs with the actual shooting of the movie. This movie is very gray and brown and blue. It is an ugly film in the sense that it has so little saturation and so little color, but it is shot very, very well with what it has. I think it makes often very good use of light and darkness to various advantages. It is very naturalistic in its lighting, because this is the time that it is. Like, light sources are very limited. It's, what light's filtering through the trees if you're in the forest, or from a small lamp or whatever else. All that lighting stuff is done super well. And, credit to them for making a lot of, even during daytime, dark sets look very natural while still being very readable. I think it would be too easy to lump this in with a lot of other movies that are sort of that same ilk of being very dark and muddy. This is very dark. I would not say it's very muddy. That's not to say I don't think they could do better with some of the lighting sometimes. There are certain things that I'm like squinting a little bit, and whether it's, the limitations of the screen that I'm watching it on or something like that, there may be a cleaner version of the film that I could have seen in theaters or something like that with better projection. So it's hard to say exactly what that experience, the experience is always the one you're having, as I pointed out in one of my videos before. Go back and watch that Rants and Raves if you haven't, by the way. I believe it's like number 3 or 4 or something like that on the quote unquote death of movies. It's an important point. But that said, like, this is, again, a writing and direction debut. And given the 2 movies that would be made after this, that makes it extra interesting to me. I have still not watched the second movie from this director, which is The Lighthouse, which in the scenes that I've seen looks like one of the most impressive uses of light and darkness. It's down to being shot in mostly in black and white, fully in black and white. I'm actually not sure. Done very well as far as I can see, but I haven't actually seen the movie. And then there's The Northman, which I actually watched on this series like over 2 years ago, I think, and I didn't actually make the connection back and forth until after. I was looking this up after, and I went, "Oh yeah, there was that film." Because I had my ups and downs with that film, but it was in a lot of ways had a similar kind of naturalistic lighting, very good cinematography, aesthetic kind of going on. And so, you can start to see a through line after 3 movies of the things that this director is good at and the places where things could be improved as well. As far as the performances and the casting, I think this is some fantastic casting This is not a very large cast. It doesn't have to be. It's basically like the family and then a few side characters here and there. And I think they're all fantastic. As far as I understand it, this is Anya Taylor-Joy's first feature film, and she's fantastic in it. I've mentioned before, I really like her. I think she does an excellent job in basically everything I've seen, and this one is no exception. I don't know how old she was in this film, but yeah, like she's got a very young face. It hasn't changed much, honestly, over the last, like, I guess 10 years that she's been working. Holy shit. But yeah, like she puts on a really good performance in this film and portrays that sort of like young, traumatized kid in a really powerful way, while also showing like the aspects of adulthood that she's having to deal with, both directly and indirectly, from her family and within herself, as she herself is, growing up and having to reckon with the world and the people that she's living in it with. At the same time, like the mother and father are two. I don't know if I would call them big actors, but Ralph Ineson has been an actor for a very long time. I've seen him in a lot of things, I think going back to like the 80s. I might be wrong on that. And like, it's hard for me to point out an individual thing that I've seen him in. I just know I've seen him all over the place. I think he was in a bunch of shows, British shows over the years as well, which is probably where I've seen him a bunch. And then the mother is played by Kate Dickie, who is probably best known as of late for being on Game of Thrones, and they both put on fantastic performances. The three other kids who are in the family as well, my feelings on kids and kid actors, but like they put on excellent performances here, in that they are irritating and childish. But like that takes skill. You can't just let a kid roam free and then film them and then have it be a good performance. Clearly these kids were disciplined and well directed. The two youngest ones are basically there as like very, very young children, basically out of control age. And then the younger brother, I think he's supposed to be younger. The second kid, I don't think he's the eldest. Has that sort of in between like childhood and adulthood kind of thing going on, and portrays that super, super well. So a similar kind of congratulations on the performance to Anya Taylor-Joy. I don't think he's done anything else, but yeah, I thought his performances were really good. Honestly, actually, now that I'm like reflecting on it a little bit, he might have some of the best performances in the entire film. And I'm a little bit embarrassed that I don't actually know his name, because it's not right in front of me. So casting wise, super well done, super well directed, super well acted. Getting those performances out of those actors in these kind of conditions, excellent. And I don't think I've even mentioned that the whole thing is performed in this very this like historical English. I am not a linguist. I have no idea how accurate their wording, their choice of words, their phrasing would have been to the time. They say at the end of the film, there's a note at the end that says, a lot of the dialogue was taken directly from accounts of the time, etc., etc. You would hope that would mean this is fairly accurate, but take that with a healthy heaping of salt. That said, I think that is both adds a level of difficulty to the performances for the actors, as well as a certain unique aspect to the performances that makes it very otherworldly in that sort of unusual sort of way of watching people you don't fully understand. Not to say you can't understand their words. It's more the strangeness of their behaviors just by being, 400-ish years ago. And so like that all adds up to really compelling performances, shot really well. And as I mentioned before, like the music serves this really well. It's quiet when it needs to be. It's absent when it needs to be. It's loud and anticipatory when it needs to be. And then all the sets, all the stuff, and then all of the practical effects that are used very sparingly, but very, very well. All to tell this like family falling apart story. It's really, really interesting. And I'm like a day away from it, still processing it, and like going through my head about like what's really good about it. Because with all these compliments I'm heaping upon it, it's still like not a perfect film, and it's not even a film that like for me personally I like, if that makes sense. Like it's not something I want to watch again because it makes me deeply uncomfortable in a bunch of ways that does not make me want to seek it out again. But I'm also so intrigued by the things that are good about it that I will probably end up watching this again at some point. It's just very impressive all around. I get a lot of the compliments that are given to it. Some of them are a little over the top because there's some holes you can poke in this, especially around some of the stuff that I explicitly didn't discuss. If this is at all your cup of tea, I mean, hopefully at this point you've already stopped to watch it or have already watched it or something. But you can, honestly, the most gruesome scene in the entire film is very near the beginning of the film. And if you see that and go, oh, I didn't like that, but I can handle it for now, you'll get through the rest of it. That's the biggest thing in the entire film. And I appreciate the restraint and the subtlety and everything else that's going on in this film. Makes it, more accessible to somebody like me who doesn't particularly like it in the first place. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'll see you guys next time.